So it's really an honor to be here, and I'm really grateful to the South Asian Studies program and all of you to give me this opportunity. Since I'm a writer, I'm sure a lot of you are interested in the way I write than the way I speak. So I have got a script in front of me, and I'll read it out if you don't mind. I'm basically trying to explain why it is important for me as a writer to tell stories set against the Assam-India conflict. And I'm a fiction writer primarily, though I write poetry and other genres. So it means that I make sense of the world through narratives. So I'll be sharing a lot of narratives, a lot of personal stories of growing up in Assam and how it has defined the lives of not just my family or me, but an entire generation of people and many other subsequent generations. So I thought I would begin by telling a story about a car, a white Maruti car. My hometown Guwahati in Assam is the largest city in India's northeastern region. It's sprawled on the banks of the mighty river Brahmaputra. It has a population of around 1.5 million people. When I was in high school, our family moved from the outskirts of Guwahati to a place in the heart of the city. Our new campus is called All India Radio Campus, where my parents still live because my father works there. Though it was in the middle of the noisy, polluted city, when my friends visited our campus, they liked to call it an oasis. During spring, laburnum, yellow and pink laburnum, and blood-red royal poinciana flowers would fall and cover the pavements and streets of our campus with fresh flowers every morning. It is a gated campus protected by a security guard. When my friends visited me, they had to sign on a fat register and sometimes even flash an identity card. I believe if they brought vehicles, they even had to write down the registration number. One day, the people in our campus woke up to the presence of an unknown Maruti car, a white one. It was parked by the playground where the swings and seesaws stood. No one knew whom the car belonged to, and few people cared. Parents who were escorting their children to the school bus stops glanced at it and wondered aloud whose car it must be. And early morning announcers who worked at the radio station hurried past it without paying much attention. The problem started only by the evening when the car remained unclaimed there for a very long time. Soon a small curious crowd gathered around it. Someone said, "We shouldn't go near it because there might be a bomb," while another person said the insurgents must have used it to kidnap some famous and wealthy person and dumped the car in our campus. Someone called up our local police station that was just 10 minutes away. Within minutes, a band of police arrived. Parents who were scared too much shut their doors and tried to watch from their windows. Children were asked not to go near it, while some adventurous teens that didn't scare that defied their parents to have a glimpse of the unfolding drama. From my apartment, I saw two dogs only, overfed, butt-wagging, barking dogs. They wagged their tails, trying to attract attention from people. They wagged their tails, sweating mosquitoes and flies that buzzed around. Both of them looked excited, too excited, like little children who are taken to the market with the promise of buying ice cream and chocolates and new clothes. Last week, when I was writing this speech, I called up my father to ask if he remembered what was it all about and when it had happened. He said a car in a protected area like our campus was a matter of concern, and the police came to check with sniffer dogs because in Assam, you can't really trust anyone or anything. Eventually, they opened the car and found that it belonged to one of the singers who performed for the radio center, who had to leave the car for personal reasons in the campus. We laughed about it. We laughed at ourselves, for we were paranoid about it. But my father also told me that he didn't remember when it had happened. How does it matter? Such incidents are so common. Maybe it was August, he wondered. I called my mother to investigate this further because I wanted to write about it and I wanted to talk about it. My mother, the first novelist who I read and emulated, the faithful curator of family memories and secrets, said the same thing. Maybe it was August or January, she told me. But I must tell you that I don't remember wearing woolens that day. But it must have been August or January. I was frustrated. I realized once again that I hate writing nonfiction because you have to get everything right. Because if I were writing fiction around this event, I could have just created a new world around it and focused only on the emotional accuracy of that moment. But this event, that the way my father, my mother, and I remember, also underline how paranoid as well as immune we have become due to the unpredictable nature of violence in our lives in Assam. For the last 3 decades, since 1979, Assam, also known as a land of rising sun, has been bleeding. Living with fear has become such a norm that few care, few worry, and a few bother to remember, because a lot of people think that we should just be grateful that we are alive, because a lot of people believe it is normal to live like that. I grew up under the duress of this conflict. I was of course disturbed and curious to know what was going on when I saw news of deaths and rapes and extrajudicial killings and bomb blasts and combats and extortions every morning in the newspaper that remained by our breakfast table. But I didn't know that I had internalized that violence and thought it was normal. I realized this a few years later. In 2004, like many thousands of students in Assam, I moved out of the state to study after I got admission to a college in Delhi University. That made my parents very happy and my relatives relieved, because that is what they wanted me to do, get out of Assam. One day in Delhi, I was astonished to find that the news about a road accident was screaming at me from the front pages of a newspaper. For some reason, I couldn't believe and was ashamed that I couldn't believe that the death of 1 or 2 common people deserved to be front page news. That made me thinking for the first time that the childhood of most of my friends who grew up in the rest of the country, except places such as Kashmir, was different from mine, that our fears were different, our breakfast conversations were different, because our front page news was different. In fact, so radically different that a few outside Assam knew about what was going on in Assam and few cared. On the other hand, we were often so nonchalant about the daily violence that has shaped several generations of people, especially the generation that was born after 1979. Assamese poet Indira Goswami very aptly sums up this culture of violence that has turned banal after 30 or more years. Her poem Laughter is written in the voice of a person who is following news from Assam in national channel in faraway Delhi. The poem is also a sharp commentary on the lack of adequate representation of issues related to Northeast India in the national media. I quote, "The first time a blast occurred, I called home after prime time news on TV. Note, a Guwahati blast making it to prime time on national television must have been big. 80 Road is not usually overlooked. Mainstream people die there. But Ganeshguri and Bamuni Moidam are on news stickers at the bottom of the screen. My mother said, 'What? That was a bomb?' We thought somebody's tire burst. My father was home and my brother out of town, so we all had a good laugh, ha ha ha. When my brother came back, he called me to say 5.5 people died, meaning 5 killed, 1 injured." The car story is not really my favorite story, and I'm not obsessed with it, but please allow me to go back to it. Because some of you must have noted that though my parents didn't remember the specifics of the car story, they wondered it must have taken place in August or January. There is something very significant about the way they remember it, the way I remember it. To illustrate it, I must go back to a childhood incident of early 90s, because for a long time, I thought this event from my childhood happened in August, until my father, who has better memory than me, said that it actually happened in November 1991. It is the year when Indian security forces descended on the villages of Assam like locusts on ripe paddy fields to catch armed rebels. The reason I thought for years that this childhood incident happened in August is the same reason why my parents also thought the white car was standing in our campus in August or January, not September or October. Our memories are treacherous, disloyal. We have to think hard to find concrete details. Otherwise, they escape from our hands like toddlers trying to catch dragonflies by holding them by their tails. You have to hold them by their wings, not tails, to own them, possess and control them, memories. August and January are no ordinary months in India. In January, we celebrate Republic Day. On 15th August 1947, India of course, got independence from colonial rule, and we celebrate Independence Day. These are both national holidays, 26th January and 15th August, are both national holidays and celebrated with great pomp and show all over the country, especially in the state capitals and of course in the national capital, which is New Delhi. But that is not the reason my parents said it must have been August or January. That is not the reason I always thought about this key event of my childhood as something that happened in August, an event that I could never forget, and whenever I would think about the widespread atmosphere of fear I had grown up in, I would remember it. In November 1991, I was visiting my aunt's house in our ancestral village, Tehsildar, with my younger brother and my father. Most of the houses in our village didn't have electricity during those days, and even if they had, the supply was rarely there. So people often slept early. I'm also talking about those days when every house didn't have a television set to keep them awake watching soap operas. We had reached late because we had boarded last bus from Guwahati to our village. Everyone in the village was asleep, and it was so quiet that even when we spoke in our normal voice, it felt that as if we were screaming at each other. My aunt's house was still a bit far away when my brother and I decided to race and play a prank on my aunt pretending to be the army. We had shoes that made sounds on the smooth gravel road coated with coal tar. We thought if we stamped our feet, my aunt would be frightened and we would be able to tease her about it. But our plan was more successful than expected. When she heard the sound of her boots, of her shoes approaching her house, she started to howl and cry and scream for help, attracting the neighbors who came in groups with different kinds of weapons in their hands: cleavers, bamboo sticks, logs of wood, knives, ladles, and pickaxes. I'm not sure what they must have thought, but they looked at my brother and me with accusing eyes, as if we had done something wrong, an unpardonable sin. As if they would eat us alive. We were confused because all we did was play a prank with our aunt. Years later, when I was discussing that event with my father, he corrected me. It wasn't August, it was November. He laid stress on the word November to suggest that he was sure. I wasn't convinced. No, Pita, it was really August. Why would she be so scared then? I can understand people being scared and vigilant during August and January in Assam. I was in college when we had this conversation. My mind raced as I spoke to him, remembering and recollecting. Was it really November? Then it must have been a pretty warm November, because I also don't remember wearing warm clothes. I don't remember people sitting around fires lit in old blackened iron cauldrons in front of their houses and chatting, a common scene during winters. I don't remember the smoke and smell of potatoes burning. Those fires are often alive with a lot of loud laughter, when the thick, eye-smarting smoke going upwards would bend towards one of the people sitting by the fire. We would tease him or her because it was believed that the smoke chased only those people who stood by the road and peed. When the smoke chased our serious uncles and scary aunts, we tried hard to suppress our laughter because we didn't dare ask them if they peed by the side of a road when no one was watching. There were no sounds of such laughter and chatter that night. No, I don't remember people doing things we usually do in winters. So what was unusual about that November of 1991? Was it really November? My father looked at me and said, no, it was November. Don't you know what was going on that year? Then, as a first-year undergrad student in college, I didn't know a lot of details. But now I do, some details. And I understand why the atmosphere of August had extended to wrap around November, why November had become synonymous with August, why no smoke chased the person who peed by the side of the road that year. All of us who experienced childhood and came of age in this part of India, Assam and Northeast, have bitter memories of August, have little recollections of an Independence Day being celebrated freely without fear. For T.S. Eliot, April must be the cruelest month, but for Assamese people and for many northeastern states, it is August that is the cruelest month. Perhaps the best phrase to describe an Assamese August is the reign of fear, because it is during this month we remember our difficult relationship with Delhi, because on the day India received independence from colonial rule, people in Assam shut their doors and stayed inside, scared to go out, scared of blasts, scared of security forces asking too many questions. Where are you going? Why are you going? What are you going to do? Scared of being frisked and losing their sovereignty over their body. The government too loses all its freedom, especially on 15th August, on Independence Day. The government unfurls the Indian flag in the middle of a field amid tight security. They sing the anthem surrounded by gun-wielding soldiers. They eat sweets and congratulate each other, hoping they won't be bombed. Not even an ant can get into the arena where march pasts are held, where sweets are distributed without getting frisked. It is during August we are scared to travel because bombs may explode on railway tracks, or we might be greeted with burning rubber tires in the middle of the highway, a tree flung across the road, a couple of hundred people protesting, blocking the road, etc. During one such August, we had to drive to my uncle's house in Golaghat, Upper Assam, a drive of 6 or 7 hours by car. My uncle's eldest daughter had killed herself for some reason. My mother was crying. I think it was 19th August. On the national highway, we saw hundreds of footwear thrown, remnants of a procession dispersed. What must they have used? Tear gas, guns, rubber bullets, or real bullets? I couldn't guess, but there were patches of blood like puddles of water after rain. Near a railway crossing, a well-dressed woman in a sari pressed a handkerchief against her bleeding forehead and sat on the road. A man got off and asked if she needed help. I didn't want to get out from home. She started to scream hysterically. I had just gone to get an injection for my asthmatic son. They broke the windows of my car, and I don't know where it is. On our way ahead, we saw burnt buses standing like skeletons of tall elephants. We smelled burning rubber. I wasn't sure of the kind of smell that I couldn't identify. I wondered if it was the smell of roasted human flesh or something else. In August, the collective grief and dissatisfaction of various groups in Assam, insurgent groups mostly, who have taken to armed rebellions, find expression in violent means, as if stopping the movements of people from growing to different places would get them the new countries they want to carve out. They believe a boycott of Independence Day would get them the states they want to carve out. August is the time when the Assam-India conflict finds expression in various concrete ways all over Assam. In August 2004, the United Liberation Front of Assam, the chief militant group in Assam which aims to establish a sovereign republic of Assam, bombed the Independence Day celebrations in a district called Dhemaji, at a place where school children were celebrating the day with little paper flags in their hands singing patriotic songs. 18 children died, several were injured. The militant organization, on the other hand, accused the Indian occupation force and its agents of using school children as a shield to defy the boycott call of Independence Day celebrations. So it was natural that I thought the childhood incident when my aunt got scared and screamed for help on hearing the approaching sound of her shoes happened in August. But November 1991 was also the year when the Indian government was waging a war in Assam against its own people. It was the second phase of the war. In the pretext of looking for insurgents, the Indian army tortured and beat to death many people, raped, maimed, and disappeared countless people in the villages where a vigilant civil society was absent, where media attention was almost nil, unlike the urban spaces, where there is at least to some extent. My aunt was scared because she must have heard about a 55-year-old school teacher, Purnodah, who was beaten by a group of Indian soldiers on the courtyard of his own house for 1.5 hours until he died. The soldiers asked him to show them the guns in his house that didn't exist. When his family members tried to come near him and give him water, they were not allowed to. My aunt must have heard about a 22-year-old woman who was raped by 7 Jawans behind her house. After they finished, they threw her unconscious body into the pond where she drowned. My aunt must have thought. She could have lived at least and told herself, when you hear the sound of leather shoes nearby, scream for help. You don't want to die like that. I hope my aunt didn't hear about the incident in Kamrup district, where 2 girls were raped in front of their mother by the army. First, they stripped their father naked and tied him into the pillar of the house. But I'm very sure my aunt must have heard about the event in Ponka, Nagaon, where 5 innocent young men were killed by the army and burnt on a pyre made of rubber tires and tubes. When the bodies didn't burn properly, they poured petrol and kerosene on them. The tale of the counterinsurgency operations in Assam is that of many such horrific crimes against humanity committed by the Indian security forces, empowered by a special law called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act that legitimizes violence, promotes a culture of impunity, disregards any alternative peaceful mode of resolving political crisis in Assam and many northeastern states. AFSPA, a mutated version of a British colonial ordinance issued against people fighting to overthrow the British imperialism, now empowers the Indian army in these designated disturbed areas to arrest without warrant and shoot to kill with mere suspicion, and several other clauses that goes against the foundation of any democratic country, and in the world's largest democracy, it is a glaring irony and a dark patch. Years ago, during those times when I had started to run away from school to watch forbidden movies in obscure cinema halls with my friends, I made a trip to my grandparents' house, alone. I was a big man after all, 14 years old. A few weeks before my visit, one of my second cousins was brutally tortured by the army because they suspected he had links with the rebels. When they came to his house, the whole village stood around the gate, watching, weeping for him. He didn't want to go, so they pushed him, dragged him. He didn't want to go, so of course he didn't want to go. So they kicked him on his back so hard, and he fell down on the ground, blood oozing out from his mouth. When I reached, I found a group of village children playing military. No one wanted to be a non-military, so the guy who was bullied most was turned into the suspected insurgent. One of the young guys said, "Should we kick him on his back? Let's do that. What is that army trick that you can kick someone on the back and blood comes out of the mouth? If the army would have kicked him on the stomach or the heart, then let's try it on him." I was stunned. I listened to them attentively. Now I think there can't be a more telling example of how violence leads to more violence, how internecine it is, and what it means to live in a country that doesn't think you are equal, because this law, AFSPA, that is responsible for most of the human rights violations in many Indian states, including Assam, makes us unequal citizens in the world's largest democracy. My aunt's November story is just a small example of its far-reaching consequences. Again, many years later, in another November, a very cold Delhi November, when I started writing what became my first novel, The House with 1,000 Stories, it was natural that the topic I was most interested by was this reign of fear, legitimized by the Indian government and perpetuated by the various insurgent organizations. Reign of fear. This phrase not just describes and encapsulates the Assamese August, but also life in terror-stricken Assam as well, rural as well as urban. When I was writing my novel, I thought about my childhood in Assam's rural areas such as Mayong and Dimoria, where our extended relatives are still around, places that have faced the brunt of the Assam-India conflict. I thought about the extinguished iron cauldrons and the funny accusations of who must have peed by the roadside, and how sporadic they became whenever the boots of the Unified Commandos or CRPF personnel made sounds on the streets of the village, made sounds on the verandas and then bedrooms of people. I also thought about the separatist insurgents who entered the houses of poor and affluent villagers and demanded to be fed duck meat, fish curry, rice, dal, fried vegetables, and make the women in the house cook in the middle of the night. The next day, the family would be assaulted by security forces for feeding the insurgents, but if they didn't feed the insurgents, they would be assaulted by the insurgents. And you really don't argue with men with guns. Though I thought about these terrible situations, I also thought about my lovely childhood in Mayong and Tehsildar village on the banks of the Brahmaputra and the Tamuli Dobha River, where I spent most of my vacations, weekends, when a lot of my classmates in school went to different places around the world to spend their holidays. In our ancestral village, though those days were reigned by fear, we also had great fun. We sneaked out of the house to bathe in the Brahmaputra River, making the blood pressure of my aunts and uncles rise when they would find out. We would sneak out of the house, catch crabs, roast them on a fire in the forests, and eat, much to the horror of my grandmother because it was one of the many forbidden food listed by her. And when we returned home after drinking honey, they didn't scold us, but only laughed, pointing at us. With my cousins, I would go find the large stones with deep cracks and small hollows where bees build the nests. We would chase away the honeybees with smoke by burning mildly damp straw and have the honey right in the hill to return home with grotesque bee-stung faces. Though there was fear around, we are gluttonous consumers of the little joys of life. Combining my wonderful childhood and adolescence with a horrific humanitarian tragedy unfolding all over Assam should have been a challenge and obstacle. But though I had written most of the first draft of my novel sitting in a hostel room in my college in Delhi, facing a wall and a window that opened towards the men's restroom in my hostel, it wasn't difficult for me at all. Pablo, the first-person narrator of my novel, as if stood by my side and told me that I wrote it as if I am his stenographer. Every story I write starts with a question for myself. While writing this book, the most important question for me was what a certain set of characters who have nothing to do with the insurgency, who have no loyalties with the government or the insurgents, would do if they are placed under this duress of fear. Will they go mad? Will they fight with each other? How will they be affected by this sense of constant fear? Will they stop going out of their houses? Will they stop going out for dates? Will they brutalize each other like those little children when they play military? What if their fear turns normal, becomes part of daily life, like the morning prayers at the village mosque or temple? How would that alter the lifestyle, worldview of these people? I didn't know. I had no clue. To find these answers, I had to write, and in the process, I discovered. Though it is Pablo's love story, Pablo's journey, I wanted the story to be an unapologetic Assamese novel about an Assam that is brutalized and yet beautiful. But I also knew that this is a story that is not about Assam only. It is a story that will be privileged and burdened with the representation of an essential hidden aspect of India. These days, as India is moving towards another general elections, we debate a lot about the pogrom in Gujarat, but many believe this wouldn't have happened if the perpetrators of the pogrom of Sikhs in 1984 would have been brought to the books. My novel is also again set against a series of state-orchestrated killings in Assam that we remember as the secret killings of Assam, when hundreds of people who were perceived as insurgent sympathizers were murdered by unknown assassins, who came with their faces covered in the darks of the night. These killings started in 1998, went on till 2001, when a new government came to power. I fear it would happen again because the perpetrators were never brought to the book, and I believe the only way to make sure it wouldn't happen again is to raise awareness about it and invite humanitarian intervention towards the situation. Since I know only how to tell stories, I tell stories about it. I say this because I believe also in the power of stories, not because I'm a writer and I want everyone to rush and buy my book or my friends' books. Lynn Hunt, in her wonderful book, Inventing Human Rights, talks about how stories encourage psychological identification. Narratives, especially novels, show the development of a character by revealing its inner self on the pages of the book. As we read on, we worry what would happen to the character, though we don't know them personally, though we don't meet them on the road when you go to buy grocery or come back from the office after a long day's work. Hunt illustrates her point by discussing the epistolary novel Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, written by British writer Samuel Richardson and published in 1740. The novel is about Pamela, a beautiful 15-year-old maid of Mr. B. He is infatuated by her, but is unable to make a formal marriage proposal because she doesn't belong to the same class. Throughout the novel, he tries to seduce and rape her, but is not successful. Eventually, he is impressed by her intelligence, resilience, and innocence, and formally proposes marriage. Hunt writes, "The Pamela craze soon engulfed England. In one village, it was said that inhabitants rang the church bells upon hearing Mr. B has finally married Pamela." James Davis, in his article Human Rights in Literary Studies, writes, and I quote, "Human rights work is at its heart a matter of storytelling. Many of the most recognizable organizations that intervene in humanitarian crisis do so in large part by using language instead of food, medicine, or weapons. The most important act of rescue for them is not delivering supplies, but asking questions, evaluating answers, and pleading with those of us who observe from a distance. Indeed, for those in need of rescue and care, the hope of being able to tell the story is sometimes the only hope. But it is also important how we tell these stories, and what kind of stories we tell. One of the writers I immensely admire is Joyce Carol Oates, who happens to teach here at Princeton. Yesterday, I went to buy her new suspense thriller, Daddy Love, and I was disappointed that the bookstore in campus didn't have a copy. But that is another story. The point I'm trying to make is that Joyce Carol Oates, whose novels cast dark eyes on the past and present and probably future of America, also writes in multiple genres. She has the freedom to write a suspense thriller and also a Gothic novel set in Princeton University of almost 100 years ago called The Accursed both published in 2013. A writer like me, who comes from a place like Assam, where civil rights are denied, where Indian citizens are rendered unequal by an undemocratic law called AFSPA, doesn't have that freedom. The pressure is immense to be a competent storyteller, as well as a socially committed, responsible writer by talking about issues that are at stake that needs attention. Very little historical work has been produced on the Assam-India conflict, especially from an Assamese perspective. And the press coverage is rarely in-depth in the national and, of course, the international media, due to which cultural productions are the ones that have had to take up the burden of voicing concerns, questioning, challenging power structures. Hence, storytelling from this part of India becomes a political act because they play a role in sustaining democracy and ensure democratic traditions, since novels and stories play a major role in promoting a sense of empathy for character and thus, in turn, a sense of equality. Many people have asked me after my book has been published, what was your aim in writing this novel? Why did you write it? What do you want to achieve now? I'm not sure if I have any answers. I wrote it because I had to remain sane. I wrote it because I heard the voice of my character very clearly, who was telling me a story about his doomed first love, and he was 17 years old in 2002. I wrote it because I wanted to celebrate the perennial resistance of the common people in rural Assam who have faced the brunt of this conflict. I wrote the book because I was thinking hard also about my generation, born just a few years around 1979, born in late 80s and early 90s and late 90s, and I hoped that they would find it resonant in their lives. I have many answers and yet none. But a few days ago, when I was thinking about these questions, I thought about the village in England in 1740s, who rang the bells in the church when they heard that Mr. B had made a formal marriage proposal to Pamela. I thought of that sonorous bell. I thought about the church, and then I just smiled to myself. I must have tilted my head back a little bit, but I must have, because the woman who was sitting not very far from me in the cafe had stared at me. But I didn't care. I was happy because suddenly I had realized, though the world is a messy place, there are people around who would still love to ring bells in a church after listening to a story. Thank you.